At the height of its global reach, Britain commanded more than a quarter of the world. Its flag flew across continents, its navy sailed every ocean. And its currency, the pound sterling, was the backbone of international trade. But power built on prestige is not the same as power built on balance sheets. By the end of World War II, Britain no longer stood on financial strength. What appeared from the outside to be a global empire was, in truth, an empire in deficit, increasingly reliant on American loans to feed its population, fund its government, and defend its interests. In 1976, the transformation was complete. Britain, once the world's financial center, requested an emergency bailout from the International Monetary Fund. Less than a generation earlier, it had been issuing loans to weaker nations. Now, it needed the same kind of help with conditions attached. This was not just a loss of prestige. It was a loss of independence. Historians speak of moral victories, of post-colonial transitions, and peaceful handovers. But beneath the diplomacy, it was economics that ended the empire. The real crisis had nothing to do with ideals. It had everything to do with insolvency. Long before its economic downfall, Britain was not just a political empire, it was a financial one. At its peak in the early 20th century, the British Empire stretched nearly 14 million square miles and governed a fifth of the global population. But its most powerful possession was not land. It was trust, global trust in the pound sterling. The pound served as the world's primary reserve currency. International contracts were negotiated in pounds. Global central banks stocked British currency as a safeguard. The financial institutions of London were the nerve center of the global economy. Colonial territories might have provided resources and labor, but London's power was cemented through finance. British investors owned railways in South America, commodity producers in Africa, and manufacturers throughout Asia. British capital, not just cannons, stitched the empire together. This gave Britain a unique advantage. It could finance its empire not through taxes, but through debt borrowed at low interest rates due to its benchmark currency status and sound monetary reputation. The pound was not just paper. Under the gold standard, it was tied to fixed, tangible value. Anyone, anywhere, could redeem pounds for gold. That convertibility created confidence, and that confidence created control. At the same time, Britain was not the largest economy. The United States had overtaken it in terms of raw output. But no other nation could match Britain's reach and financial synchronization across continents. All empires consist of logistics, resources, and projection of power. But Britain's greatest weapon was that it owned the rules of the game. It did not just play global finance, it refereed it, for as long as the world needed British currency. London could guide the global flow of credit, investment, and policy. But as history showed, that advantage only lasts as long as the balance sheet supports it. No empire collapses in a single moment. Britain's decline began with what seemed like strength, its decision to fight and ultimately survive 2 world wars. But the financial cost of survival was devastating. During World War I, Britain poured everything into the war effort. The total cost reached over £35 billion, a figure that, relative to the economy at the time, was overwhelming. Britain's gross domestic product in 1914 was barely a fraction of that. The war had consumed 14 times the nation's annual output. To stay afloat, Britain raised taxes, borrowed extensively, and sold its most valuable international assets. It also abandoned the gold standard to freely print money, breaking the sacred trust that underpinned the pound's global role. Beyond the battlefield, something else had changed. For the first time in over a century, Britain became a debtor nation, primarily to the United States. By the time the Second World War exploded in 1939, Britain was already financially fractured. Yet again, it threw its full weight behind resistance, devoting more than half its national output to the war. That kind of total mobilization, heroic as it was, also meant cutting off everything that was not essential to military survival. By 1941, Britain was functionally bankrupt. Then came the Lend-Lease Act, a turning point dressed as a lifeline. The United States agreed to provide food, weapons, and support, but not out of charity. It came with long-term strategic strings. equal access to British markets, dismantling trade privileges within the empire, and full transparency over Britain's finances. The final blow came after the war. By 1945, Britain's debt was 250% of GDP, a burden heavier than most modern debt crises. To cover its obligations, Britain liquidated assets on a global scale. Gold, real estate, art, and foreign holdings were all sold off. And when the dust settled, the pound had lost its throne. The world no longer looked to London. It turned to Washington. The reserve currency torch had been passed, not by diplomacy, but by default. If debt had hollowed out Britain's empire, the Suez Crisis exposed just how empty the shell had become in 1956. Egypt's president Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, a strategic waterway that Britain had controlled for decades. In response, Britain coordinated with France and Israel to launch a military intervention. Tactically, it worked. Within days, British forces had regained control of the canal zone, but the victory was short-lived. There was a more powerful force waiting, not on the battlefield, but in the bond markets. The United States, under President Eisenhower, opposed the operation. And, instead of sending troops, it sent a message: withdraw or we will bury the pound. The U.S. threatened to sell off its British currency reserves and block crucial loans from the International Monetary Fund. Britain, already weakened by decades of debt and economic decline, could not afford a collapse in the pound. It caved, militarily undefeated, but financially cornered. The world watched. So did Britain's colonies. The message was unmistakable. The empire could no longer act without external approval. Military might was now meaningless in the absence of financial sovereignty. In the aftermath, Prime Minister Anthony Eden resigned in disgrace. The pound came under renewed pressure. Independence movements across Asia and Africa accelerated, not out of rebellion, but from the simple realization that Britain no longer had the means to resist. The Suez Crisis did not start Britain's fall, but it confirmed it. A nation once feared for its global influence had become vulnerable to monetary threats. In the 20th century, dominance belonged not to the army that could occupy, but to the nation that controlled the credit line. History, when ignored, has a way of repeating, only faster. The United States today holds the same position Britain once did: a dominant military, a global reserve currency, a vast network of alliances, and an economy supported by global demand for its money, not just its goods, but beneath the surface. The similarities have become unsettling. America's national debt has passed $35 trillion. Federal interest payments now exceed the defense budget. For decades, the United States has consumed more than it produces, running massive trade deficits covered by the mere privilege of issuing the world's most used currency. That privilege, like Britain's before it, feels permanent. But history suggests otherwise. Britain's decline was not caused by a single decision, but by a series of unsustainable financial strategies, each designed to delay reckoning while appearing to maintain strength. The United States has followed a similar path: endless military engagements, rising entitlement costs, tax cuts financed through borrowing, and the assumption that global capital will forever support its spending. But cracks are forming. The dollar's dominance is being quietly contested. Nations are diversifying reserves. New payment systems like SIPs are emerging to challenge SWIFT. Gold reserves are rising in the East, while global trust in U.S. fiscal management erodes. Slowly, when Britain lost control of the reserve currency, it lost everything that financial sovereignty could provide: influence, flexibility, and prestige. It could no longer act on the world stage without permission. The terrifying question is, what does America have to fall back on if that moment arrives? Britain had literal lands to let go of. It liquidated its colonies. It sold off art, gold, assets, and global goodwill. It lost an empire, but preserved a democracy. The United States holds no physical empire to sell back. Its reach is digital, economic, ideological, and more fragile than it appears. The difference now is speed. Britain's global decline unfolded across 3 decades. In today's hyper-connected financial ecosystem, the United States could face similar consequences in half that time. Because when your global power is built on borrowed money and borrowed time, the reckoning does not arrive slowly. It arrives when the creditor stops believing.